Okay, hi everybody. How are we today? Yay, I love that. The enthusiasm, my friend. Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Sarah Colley. I am the Community Engagement Coordinator here for the Great Falls Public Library. The Great Falls Library is here to connect people and knowledge in all sorts of different ways, including talks with community members, author talks, events, whatever it might be. We like to kind of be a part of all of it. So tonight's talk is a part of a new series that we have, Learning with Leigh. This is Leigh. We are going to be doing this as a monthly program, so if you enjoyed tonight's program, please come back for our next one in January. So that's super exciting. So Leigh Larson is a storyteller. Whether it's writing, speaking, filming, or digital designing, Miss Larson aims to make stories relatable, entertaining, and memorable for her audiences. She completed her undergraduate at the University of Texas at Austin with a bachelor's in international relations and minors in environmental sciences and world religion and philosophy. She worked in Texas politics prior to serving as a minister in the USAFR Chaplains Corps and for a church in Denver. She has successfully helped start a recovery nonprofit in Denver, before growing her skills in tech as a web and graphic designer before launching her web and graphic business full-time. She has visited 46 American states, many national parks, as well as many, many different countries. She is an avid hiker, explorer, women's advocate, and collector of stories. Tonight's presentation is A Baby Born in the North. We hope that you learn a lot during today's presentation. Remember that Leigh is a researcher and an avid reader as well. And so she even has a resource list at the end of every program, so that's awesome. We love the fact that you are all here today. We are excited to continue this program in the future. And without further ado, Leigh.
Coming, that means a lot to me, and then of course just more seats in the library, right? Tonight we're going to talk about a baby born in the North, motherhood in Montana. Got the idea, this month in particular, there's a certain story of a baby that's very popular. I'm thinking about motherhood with that. But also just driving down a Montana road, when you look at the landscape. How did women do this? How did families, how did we do this? So that's the kind of combination of looking at pregnancy and birth, but also child rearing practices. It's also super important that what we have about women's maternity and child care, child rearing, really stems from post-1800s literature and with rising indigenous women's literature that we'll be drawing our sources from. But we know that there have been folks in this territory, this region, for 10 to 13,000 years, which means that women have been giving birth for that long. So we're going to look at early settler practices. We're going to look at a little bit of indigenous practices, a little bit of European settler, not necessarily quote-unquote white settler, but looking at Scandinavian, Irish Celtic, just different customs, and then how they all kind of converged with the rise of the American Medical Association. And we'll stop, some of the dates bleed over, but we'll stop right around the 70s and 80s. There it is again. We'll go specifically, we'll look at Crow and Salish Kootenai. Touch a little bit on Blackfeet, and then we'll go into the different Europeans. So, why it mattered to me? Montana had the first female elected to Congress. You're a red state that also had recently codified women's right to medical privacy last year. You have plenty of women-owned businesses, lawyers, clergy, military, people in leadership positions. As someone who is from the American South, how does that happen? So that's always been kind of how I've approached Montana. It's like, how are these women so empowered? Because growing up, I had to justify my existence a lot. A quick note before we talk about the indigenous content. As mentioned, a lot of what the original writings were written through the lens of westernized European men who also carried, their values very much informed by their own religion that they brought. So, in a lot of the language, the narrative of early explorers and researchers that documented indigenous women's healthcare, not even healthcare, but just what they noticed, was again through that lens. Indigenous customs are rooted in a totally different paradigm than the West. In fact, Western philosophy, the Stoics, Plato, they had heavy influences on just the paradigm and the way we see the world. For example, one example is that they look at things in a sort of, Plato is famous for having a sort of object philosophy. If there is one thing, but then there becomes a second thing, that second thing needs to be either conquered, or and it could be a threat to resources, or it could be a helper, but it's not an equal. And that's a very Platonic philosophy that has persisted, that if there's more than one thing, that second thing is a threat or some sort of liability to the first thing. It needs to be conquered, dominated, etc. That is not the paradigm that a lot of indigenous folks out, especially in North America, and in this region, were carrying. This idea that just because one thing exists, it suddenly is in competition or in direct contrast, or this like very intense oppositional binary. These things are, and that's just simply not a lot of, not common in a lot of different indigenous thoughts. Because again, not a monolithic narrative, lots of different tribes and nations. Furthermore, when a lot of the early historians came to the American West, or just to the United States, and did all their research on indigenous practices, and this is not just common to North America, but they would often rewrite any stories, myths, cultural myths, in which women were empowered. We see that in Viking stories, when the Christians conquered Scandinavia, how they took a lot of Viking stories that had women in very powerful positions and relegated them to more like handmaids. But we also see this here. The sky goddess of Haudenosaunee. It's the Iroquois, as commonly known. That's not their name. Haudenosaunee, which is also a confederate of different nations. But for them, out in New England, their cosmology was very much a female deity that fell from the sky. And I'm not going to elaborate too much, but in the story, in her line, eventually, she goes to have a daughter, named the world. Eventually, that daughter gives birth, and there's twin boys. And for a lot of early European colonial historians, they would just start the story at the twin boys and forget the whole rest of the sky stuff. So we know that we can't trust the old text simply because of the lens that they were looking at. So we'll be relying on rising indigenous scholarly work that's really come out since the 1970s. And again, the source list will be at the end, and all to say, that's where the sources are. So I did the crow to show the plains, and then Salish, Kootenai, and Blackfeet to just show mountainous areas. Sarah told me not to use the mic.
Oh, then don't use the mic.
We can use the mic. Do y'all want the mic? No? Okay. We're not going to go too deep into like specific rituals or ceremonies, mainly because A, they're sacred, and it's not necessarily pragmatic. But I really want to talk about the cultural lens in which they're working through the way they see the world and how that impacts how they're going to have children and raise them. So, for one, the Crow women, which typically we can find closer to the border of Wyoming in that region, this is actually not even their home grounds. They were forcibly relocated from Midwest Mississippi, and they had a strong, they had their their nations that they were living in. But the extended family system is a very key part, particularly when you think about how are you going to bring a child into this world. You know that you have aunts, uncles, siblings, you've got a full network to support. This was also really important with just like how they would talk about pregnancies and family planning. Sometimes it was kind of a family decision. Is this a time for all of us to take on a new baby? Could also not be, it could be a time of migration, time of war, time of drought, there's different reasons, but ultimately there was this, you had a network. You also, Crow women could divorce and terminate. There's the idea of marriage is even very Western. This idea that you can now get into this legal contract with a monogamy and like this. And so yes, there is monogamy, but there also wasn't this intense pressure that like you're going to do this and this is your worth. It was a bit very much more, I say relaxed. But even this idea of marriage and divorce was not as, if you divorce her or break your marriage, this idea of sin and shame was not there. It was simply the marriage of dissolved. We also know that they use different types of herbs to either prevent pregnancy or to terminate pregnancy, again, based on what their needs were, what was going on. Ultimately, it was a very women-centric birth, as is, we'll go into Salish Kootenai, as is theirs as well. Very, women were the ones that were part of the labor and delivery process. They exchanged stories throughout the pregnancy, and again, very female, women-centric. Men typically were not part of the birthing process, but they could be around to assist or facilitate if something needed to be done. But it was very much a woman-led thing. And then also we know that they had different positions in birthing, and the way it was written about, again, by these early European and particularly British educated, probably wealthy men, had a lot of opinions on this. But also, as we'll find in the next few slides, it was because of what they thought was the proper way for a lady to birth, which again, interesting. There was a lot of, again, trust, stories, relationships, and guidance with your elder midwives. And their pregnancies were not idle. They were active, movement. We see, do I have? I don't know if you can tell, but these two artworks were drawn on antique maps. The artist is out of Missoula, Aspen Decker. She's Salish Kootenai. She also goes around to different universities and institutions educating folks on Salish Kootenai. This is her art, and she also was someone who I interviewed for this portion. But as you see, there are women that are on horseback, that are a woman teaching her daughter to hunt. This idea that women should be in the home just was not, that wasn't even in their worldview. Why, even things that were very hyper-gendered, like pink and blue having certain connotations of color. How can you gender color? Those colors are in the sunset. Everybody appreciates them. So just these whole paradigms that even with like hunting and running and sports, being part of that natural world, do female animals not run, jump, swim? Do female animals not defend? You're young, are they not tough? So very much in that relationship and seeing themselves and how that applies to gender. So here's where the struggles with indigenous women's like motherhood over time has happened. And a lot of that is because of U.S. policy, as we'll see. For one, early on, just their children were taken from them, sent to boarding schools. When they returned, they came back Americanized. These were no longer their cultured babies. Their babies had been taken. Furthermore, in those schools, the boys were taught American Protestant Christian value, Western schools, these were Western schools, a lot of them taught by Catholic or Christian, either nuns or assistants, teachers. But they were learning, the girls were learning domestic skills, and the boys were learning manual labor. These were not jobs that were setting up these kids to one day be politicians and lawmakers. This was indoctrinating folks into young indigenous girls now being reliant on boys who will only understand manual labor, because so it keeps them. This was very intentional, that the labor and skills they were teaching them would keep their wages low. We talk about the bison and buffalo killings, but also the deforestry, the mining. When you start, taking things that are buried in mountains and putting them in the rivers, that plays effect in just those who are still living in the natural world. What we also know is how they were relocated from their homelands, where they also migrated during seasons. There was movement, there was exploration, there was change dynamic, there was living in this relationship with a changing world, and put them in stationary land allotments, and they were living off rations. That is going to impact maternity care. That's going to impact maternal health. That's going to impact menopause, PCOS, other things that are really critical for what I call the hardware. The other thing that was really difficult, just from a leadership standpoint, being able to advocate, was the American government refused to honor or allow women to sign treaties that they made within indigenous nations, even if the women held tribal authority to do that. Even if the nation was like, well, we sent her, why can't she say, well, we don't recognize women? So over time, a lot of indigenous groups had to then become more and more patriarchal, and as women lost role within their own groups, as those groups were trying to be able to survive within this growing colonizer group, if that makes sense. So you've got part of what really has intrigued me in Indigenous women's healthcare is in my own bloodline. We found Indigenous women in the Delaware, South Carolina, going down the eastern out into Texas, and just how she's had to change and adapt in order for me to exist now. This is generations ago, but this denial of self. Even we know women changing in the Census Bureau, claiming whiteness and abandoning this whole indigeneity, and how much that would hurt you. But then we've got, aside from this, quote-unquote emotional traumas, I don't know, but you have these real forced non-consensual sterilizations and hysterectomies. We know that was going on in the 1930s and 40s. That was the big eugenics movement. That's Nazi Germany. Big eugenic stuff going on. But then we start going into hysterectomies and women not knowing that they have had organs been removed. This is by the Indian Health Services. This becomes a really big deal and is what later, when I talk about in the 1970s, there's a lot more work that's been published. A lot of it is because of these sterilizations and hysterectomies. And then at some point, in the 1950s, 1960s, the United States government, after everything they've just done, was like, you know what? We're not going to fund natives anymore. So we're going to terminate all policies. We're going to get them off the government's bill. And so you took people that were wholly now dependent on you and dropped it back. So that's destabilizing. And then something that I didn't know was that in order, that after all of these different arguments I've made, if there were indigenous women who were low income, in order for them to access welfare benefits, they were forced onto birth control. I think, yeah. And also the testing of birth control on indigenous women. So there's a lot there about when we look at motherhood in Montana, this is all from Crow, this was in here. So a completely different trajectory than what we'll find in just a second. And then two last bullet points is when I look at Native American or indigenous feminist texts about their history, women's history, there's a deep relationship tied again with the land. And there's a lot of language around sexual assault being likened to what has happened to their land. And I think it's very profound. So I do see that because if you start like here in all these different ways of controlling fertility, you're controlling populations, you're controlling who has access to those things. So very political, and also just a lot going on. It's pretty intense. As we move into settler customs, this is early Montana. Your dominant groups are going to be outside of the indigenous, which I've just named, who are not the only indigenous, but your predominant groups are going to be Germanic, Irish Celtic, Scandinavian, and of course everyone from England, Scotland, Ireland, Eastern European. And then we do have in our history lots of Chinese, Hispanic, and Black folks. We have particularly on China the railroad, and evidence of Hispanic and Black folks working in farms, owning property. Stagecoach Mary is a very famous Black woman. So we know that it's not just white and indigenous people. So just a note, when I say European customs and like why people were brought out here, yes, we do know of people being inspired from across the sea, coming over here, get off ship, and then they go straight to a particular state. There were also a lot of folks that went west because the government was encouraging it, and labor laws were awful back east. That the men were facing some pretty brutal conditions working in the factory. And this idea of being able to leave all of it behind and going and getting yourself a nice little homestead on the government's dime, pretty attractive to again, these conditions and labor in the cities, especially. Well, there's also other stuff going on. So we know that there were already Americans here, but then left their existing places and left to go west. And a lot of those women did not want to go. They had their moms, they had their sisters, they had their tea, they had their furniture. Why would I go west? Who would I hang out with? What resources would I have? But then there were also a lot that were motivated by this idea of manifest destiny, that they got to be the Christian women on the home front, that they saw themselves as heroes. So you have a couple of different motivations for the women coming out here. Some were scared to have children out here. Some were more than excited. But what we do know, yes, there's individual little idiosyncrasies, but we know that also coming from these different European countries outside of Western Dame, there's the use of doulas, midwives. We know that they could be formally trained, that there were institutions where women could travel to and get trained and go back into their communities. As early as 1400s. There were home births, typically surrounded by women, and we know that here in Montana, these doulas and midwives would stay with these Montana women for weeks at a time after the birth to make sure that everything was okay. So they brought their European customs here, and we saw that happen. We saw doulas, midwives, really critical part. Not only that, but again, these women-led, these women-centric event, was these doulas, midwives would also bring their daughters or their nieces. And so some girls were raised in this. I mean, truly, they've been helping deliver babies since they were 6 years old. We don't have a lot of evidence of any exchange or support between settling European women and indigenous. That would be a story if one of them helped the other, but we don't. That was not the dynamic they shared. So, why is Montana different? And how, particularly because, like I said, I'm from the South. This is a different world up here. So, the West provided the opportunity for women to prove their grit. A lot of women came out here, and it's dangerous. It's hard winters. Those long, dark winters also don't do anything for alcoholism. and domestic violence. So you have women that really had to prove their grit out here, very isolated. And also, it's just dangerous conditions, even if their man was a great husband. There's 1,000 ways to die out in the West, and these widows and divorcees needed to be able to have shelter, own shelter, have jobs. Well, that, of course, leads into taxes. So now we've got voting rights. So very quickly, the conditions of the West prompted these very tough kind of women. They're also, again, that sparse population plays a huge role. Also, the constitutions out here in these territories had not been settled. They hadn't been created. You could have all these people who could look at the very Victorian influence New England and this very like Southern Bible Belt and say, well, what do our constitutions, what are they going to look like? So it was a different world that hadn't been settled, where women like Annie Oakley could then show that there was more to being a woman than just a lady in the kitchen. Annie Oakley was actually a big part of that. But, I mean, women's birthing and who gets to have the authority has long been controversial, and it's here even in 1989. There was a woman on trial for not having the right credentials who had helped facilitate X number of births but hadn't gone through the proper channel. So this idea of who gets to say they are a healthcare professional and who gets to be in the women's space of birth has long been contested. But here, in the rise of the American Medical Association, it needed standardization, like I said. There were a lot of people running around basically like snake oil salesmen. Had all sorts of ideas about what you should and should not do about birth. And so there needed to be a standard. The problem was that women did not have access to education at the time. So who was writing these? Not women. So you've got this perspective that is not able to do the very thing that it's making different procedures and protocols for. It's also the rise of the hospital. And those early hospitals were not clean. They did not rat. The idea of germ theory was not as present. Puerperal fever, which is germs that you contract from not washing your hands, was high, and it's responsible for something like 10% of maternal deaths in the hospital at the early age. So you don't have, you're bringing all these women and you're not, they just weren't washing their hands. Furthermore, now you're asking a pregnant woman to be transported, which is tough. When it used to be in her home, in her bed, she didn't have to do anything but stay in her comfort space. No, this is not at all. My mom's a labor and delivery nurse, and hospitals in Western medicine are great. It's when we start assuming that this is how we start making decisions for other people, is what I'm trying to say. Furthermore, the American Medical Association hated the ideas of doulas and midwives and launched a full-scale propaganda against them. Really went after, ironically, how unclean these midwives and doulas were. That they didn't know what they were talking about. They didn't go through Harvard academia. How could they possibly know how real science works if they didn't have a degree? Now, again, you're telling people that have been doing this since they were 6 years old, they don't know what they're talking about. This is a full-scale, very much claiming that doulas and midwives were not accepting the science, that these were, very primitive things that they needed to evolve. And really, it did. It played a role. It started to freak out women and pregnant women that, oh no, am I not doing the right thing to give my baby the best outcome? And just other things. There's a lot of, even within certain religions, there's different ways to look at healthcare and women, and the fact that there's so much discrepancy amongst denominations and amongst religions plays a role in healthcare access, especially state to state, as women are navigating. So this is kind of all where it all funneled into, but of course the additional challenges as named that the indigenous women experienced, how motherhood in Montana has come to be. Now, I have Jeanette Rankin, but this is actually Susie Walkingberry Yellowtail. I wanted to say a couple of things about it. So Jeanette Rankin also recognized what was going on. A lot of what she did in office was to secure funding and promotional material for women's fertility services, reproductive health, and that was huge. Also, some folks say that could have been why she was not elected again. Other folks say it was just the times. But right out of the gate, we know that Montana women were very much just trying to make sure that other women had the right access to sanitation and birthing on their terms. And then we have Susie Walkingberry, Yellowtail, as mentioned. She was a nurse in the Indian Health Services, and she was the one that noticed all of the forced sterilization and the forced hysterectomies. And for that, and sounded the alarm, really brought that into advocacy. And so it's because of her that has been brought to light. So here are my sources in very small font. And that's all I have. I know that was a shorter one, but thank you so much for hanging out with me. Do you all have any questions?
I believe you said the crow, we use different herbs and things to terminate pregnancies. You know how effective they got at it? I mean, were they able to, if they wanted to terminate pregnancy, do that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there were times where it didn't work, but that's also common. The idea of a woman terminating her pregnancy isn't specific to North American indigenous folks. That's been going on forever. But yeah, I'm sorry, I can get more specific. Yeah.
So that's the history. Where are we today?
Oh yeah, that's a great question that I don't know if I can actually talk about. There are certain things to get a little dicey. I stopped right around the 1970s, and really as we get into more Roe v. Wade, this is, and now we're in modern history, and I don't know what I'm allowed to say as a tax-paid public library. But yeah, that's right now it's looking like lots of shared information. This story, and particularly everything that Indigenous women's history, healthcare history, I didn't notice. So just that is becoming more and more brought to light. And who knows what the future of women's healthcare is.
Isn't there though more home births being done now? It's not necessarily more, but
Oh, like in general.
yeah.
Sorry, I meant like the direction of women's healthcare policy. Yeah, I mean, we are seeing more and more doulas, midwives. We're seeing different ways that birth control is being examined. Lots of homeopathic things. While also, there's still birth control being recommended. There's still family planning. There's apps now that you can use to track your menstruation cycles. I think, yeah. Anyone else?
Is there a book about the RN? The
Susie Yellowtail?
Yeah, is there actually a book that she wrote, or?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know. Probably. I know that she's written quite a bit. How I found her, Brianna Theobald is a Crow. I don't know how to zoom that in, but
That's okay.
Brianna Theobald has written a
can't see
lot
it
of work
anymore.
on Crow women specifically.
Okay.
But any of these. So Jennifer, I'll hop on here. So Jennifer J. Hill. And Winifred Gallagher. They do a lot of like European settler women's history, looking at women's rights. This is Andrea Smith, Lacey Dudley's Native American. And then Walmart, he's just an American historian. But yeah, lots of different content with different levels of intensity. So, or different levels of intensity, different stories, different representations. But yeah, I had a stack of like 9 books I was gonna bring, and then I forgot them on the table. So, here you go. So,
Question, Lee. I read an article, this is probably 10 years ago or so, the New York Times did a research of the cost of childbirth across the world, and it found that, in the US it was among the most expensive countries. The propaganda to rid or to discredit doulas and midwives, in your research, have you found, is there like a commercialization or kind of an economic element to that?
oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's the social, now like everyone is coming, traveling, there's a control aspect to it. Also, European women did not naturally birth on their backs. We have stories from Viking and Scandinavian women squatting and kneeling, so German. So we also know that they changed the way, is this why women have control? Then again, like you said, insurance companies get involved, you've got this whole narrative around it, and suddenly it's a whole pipeline. And, where the midwives and doulas, how lucrative is it for a doula or a midwife to come stay 2 or 3 weeks with the, So it's, there's definitely this like modification and commercialization of a coldness almost, I guess is the best way to what birth is. In addition to the socioeconomic. But again, like I said, my mom's a labor and delivery nurse. This is not anti-hospitalization. It's just different ways of doing things, and birthing for a long time. Cool. All right, folks.
Thank you.
That's all.
Thank you.
All right, so thank you guys so much for being here today. We did figure out when our next one is going to be, so that is January 13th at 6:30 here in the Cordingley room. And that will be, at least as of the last time I know, civil rights and understanding of critical court cases of the 20th century. So come on out for that, January 13th. As always, we have things going on here at the library, but I think that this might be one of our last December programs. So thanks for being here. Do I have something else? I don't think so. I guess we'll find out if
Saturday.
Huh?
Santa comes to this room.
Santa comes to this room on Saturdays. Yes.
Yes.
I meant for like adult programming. There's things going on for kiddos every single day, so check that out on our socials. But thank you all for being here, and I look forward to seeing you at our next program. Have a good one.